Hello, everyone, everywhere. It is Sunday, January 29th. I am in Venice, California, and it is relatively early morning on a morning we would normally be having a mental obsession discussion, but we take the last week of every month off, and it occurred to me that since I can often be dominating in the conversation that's called a discussion and turn it into a monologue, that maybe a monologue would be in order. And so I am going to talk today from the point of view that I do my best to convey and don't always do well enough to get it across about the mental obsession and about the core of disease in terms of mental disease. As far as I'm concerned, it is the source of all of the mental ailments. And that may seem like a big stretch. And certainly I'm not a doctor or anyone that could be qualified to make that comment, but I'm certainly qualified by experience to see that if the basis of my thinking is incorrect, it's going to impact and affect all of the thinking I'm doing and all of my mental capacities. And that doesn't take a lot of mathematics or science to understand. So addiction as a symptom, a byproduct of obsessive thinking, and obsessive thinking is an addiction, and addiction is obsessive thinking because they start there. The symptom of addiction is the idea that I have no other choice. And if I had no other choice, first of all, I probably wouldn't use choice as an excuse to justify I didn't have it. And secondly, I'd just simply be doing the thing that I claimed I didn't have any other choice, rather than be justifying it at all. I would just be acting on it, just instinctively, just like all instincts tend to have us do. It doesn't require thinking. We just know to do what we're doing when we're doing those instinctive things and don't even think about it. So there are elements in our whole experience that we don't think about at all. And I would say that the most complexity that we witness in our experience, our bodies, the chemical reactions going on internally, the nerves, the sensations that are being produced as a result of the environment that we're in, we don't think about it at all. What we think about are the effects. How do I feel? What do I think about what's going on? So thinking is very primary to our human experience. But when we have used thinking in a way that has completely perverted its point, as far as I'm concerned, and I suspect, given that addiction itself, recovery, really was only a concept that began to develop in the late 1800s. So it's relatively new, given human history, to even conceive of ways that people can recover from addictions, all the symptomatic effects of this addictive thinking. It's a relatively new concept, an idea. For centuries, millennia, people with addictive problems were written off and thrown away like lepers. Institutionalized, jailed, killed. There was no hope for them. There was no place for them but to lock them up and put them away and keep them off the streets because they were of no use. They couldn't help themselves. They were clearly a danger to themselves and others. And those sorts of people typically are found to be worthy of exclusion from society. So there was no real valuable option. And then in the late 1800s, there were a group of people that started, they happened to be Christians, and they started asking, what was it that Jesus was doing back in the early days that we're not doing anymore? He was talking about healing and love. What is it that we're not doing when it comes to where's the healing today? Where's the love today? And in that pursuit began to develop religions, Christian Science, religious science, science of mind, other religions that started looking at the essence of our own functional capacity and our either willingness or unwillingness to express that essence and start to consider it something differently than had been promoted by more developed forms of religion at the time. And out of that came the idea of helping people who were hurting. And some of those people obviously were alcoholics at the time. And what's interesting about the development of AA is that it really fell on the heels of prohibition. So within 15 years of prohibition, I don't remember the exact dates. I think it was mid-19 teens. People were obviously, if they were looking at prohibiting the use of alcohol, they were obviously recognizing some damage that was being done socially in the lack of control that people were exercising in its use that was very, very harmful. And it basically permeated every society on earth in terms of the capacity of societies to include people who were struggling with alcoholism. So the potential of recovery came out of that. And AA, I would say, is one of the best examples. It is not the only example, and there are other ways people have gotten sober, even through history. Carl Jung said that a vital spiritual experience was needed to help people recover from this seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, mind being at the center of it, and the body being a consequence of that mentality. So people started recovering. Bill Wilson was a voice in the wind for many, many, many months when he began to realize that this message could be carried to other people and talked to other people about and could actually be assimilated by other people. And as a result, conveyed in a way that would allow them the freedom to begin to see that they have choice, that there is something greater than their own understanding, and that when their own understanding is misunderstanding, they're bound to be doing things that hurt them in the name of trying to save them. And that, I would say, is a good description of addiction. It's the idea that we become the master of an idea that's untrue. And the obsessive nature of thinking has us think that if we think more about it, that it will get better. What does it do? Give us a sense of condemnation. We become the slave to it, or we think we are. So we're both the master and the slave, beating ourselves on one end of the circle, trying to escape from the master by returning to the master, and everywhere we run, the master follows and beats the hell out of us. Self-loathing is natural. Self-abuse is natural. These are all natural byproducts of that thinking. So our discussion, based in the mental obsession, is that one of the key components of sobriety is recognizing that selfishness, self-centeredness, needs to be eliminated. And it talks about smashing it at depth and things like that, which would seem to me to leave some parts left over. But ultimately, the big book says completely abandon yourself, utterly abandon yourself. The result was nil until we let go of old ideas, absolutely. These comments that were made were not relative comments. They weren't things of try and do it a little and you'll be better. It was begin to see that the goal was eliminating it completely, and that the freedom that comes from that is beginning to see that what we've been doing hasn't been right the whole time. It's just simply been a self-imposed circle that goes on and on and on and on and on. And so what has largely come out of that, and I would not say that Alcoholics or Anonymous or any of the anonymous programs are self-help, because my sense is, my experience is that trying to help a self that is basically created in thought and isn't who we are would be to give it credit for being something that it isn't. And once again, completely undermine our capacity to even be thoughtful and considerate and contemplative in an honest way. It would be dishonest. And that's it. One of the roots of AA is about honesty. One of the roots of sobriety is about honesty, responsibility, accountability. It's not about being irresponsible and unaccountable and dishonest. So for me to act on behalf of a self that doesn't even exist except to what I think would be a major flaw in the ointment. The fly in the ointment is the idea that somehow I exist based on what I think, that my existence depends on thinking. Now, there is plenty of evidence in the world today of people who are in either vegetative states where they're not thinking and they're still alive, they're still existing, and or they're thinking poorly and still surviving, and or they're thinking psychotically and they're still surviving. So survival apparently isn't completely dependent on thinking correctly or thinking at all. But the quality of that survival certainly is impaired by thinking in ways that are not functional, not literate, not accurate, not honest. And it doesn't surprise me. Now, AA is coming up on a 90-year anniversary in 2025. It was 90 years since Bill and Bob got together, and being the first two that ever connected around the idea that Bill had tried so hard to explain to people that nobody wanted to hear. And I don't know that they didn't want to hear it. My suspicion is their ears were not ready to hear something that seemed preposterous. So 90 years in is not a long time for an organization to exist and have some of the basic fundamental aspects of what was originally developed become clear. And I would say this conversation begins to approach that. I'm not sure that this is the only conversation about this, because I suspect people have been struggling with this issue since the beginning of history. Humans have notoriously been seeking and on a quest to find. And if the seeking they're doing is on a quest that is still continuing, they've apparently not found what they're looking for. And it would seem that one of the hardest places to find would be the place you are, the place you're in, if you don't think you're there. And what would be caused but an endless search for that place that you were in to begin with, and are pretty sure if you return to would still not be the place. When in fact, the place we're always in is exactly where we are. It's not ironic. What's ironic is that we think it isn't. Our thinking has been backward for centuries, decades, centuries, millennia from the beginning. And it all stems from one simple mistake. And I tell you this and talk about this because my own experience, I am 35 years sober this past year. August 8 was my original sober first day, and August 8/88, not ironically, I suspect, being an infinite number 8, was my first year, something I was incapable of getting as long as I entertained the idea that I could control and enjoy my drinking and my drugging. And as long as I maintained that idea, I tried to prove I was right. And how did I try to prove it? By doing more and more alcohol and doing more and more drugs and saying because I hadn't killed myself yet, I got this under control. That's a pretty good form of insanity. But the insanity does not end with the beginning of sobriety. It actually allows, once the symptom is arrested, once we're recovered from the symptom, the underlying issue of the unmanageability of a mentally obsessive thought, meaning I can't manage something that I'm obsessed over, and I'm obsessed over it because I'm trying to prove it's right. The only reason I would be trying to prove it's right is because it's wrong. And that basic conflict is exactly what I drank to feel better then. So getting back to the self-help idea, if we're helping the self and trying to feel better about what we're doing that's wrong, we're not solving the problem at all. We're continuing to maintain the problem with the idea that the effect is the problem. What's the effect? How I feel. What's the cause? What I think. If I'm treating the effect, if I'm treating the symptom, if I'm treating feeling bad, and I'm constantly trying to feel better, which I've never had anyone come to me and say, I want to feel worse. Seems to be a trend in self-help today, $10 billion industry of helping people feel better. What are they trying to feel better then? The thought they're having that's worse. Same thing I do. And this has been set in motion for so long, and it has been held as common and so normalized that we think the sick nature that we've created is human nature. It isn't. Our nature is still based on an absolute platform that is not sick. The universe today is functioning as well as it's ever functioned. The earth is doing everything it's designed to do as well as it's ever done it. It may be struggling under the weight of things that we have created, and there's argument over that. There's argument over our experience or our time here has had any impact on the earth. Well, how could it not have an impact if we've been here for as long as we have? Certainly, it would seem accountable and responsible to simply admit that whatever the impact is the impact, whatever it is, without debating over it and trying to isolate it and trying to argue over it to say, well, if it wasn't us in this respect, it can't be us in any respect. It's exactly what I did in my life, trying to figure out how to avoid admitting the responsibility of my responsibility. Blaming, faulting, shaming, complicating, creating a camouflage of thoughts and conflicts to make believe that somehow or another, if I could get the camouflage right, I could hide the fact that I was central to the problem. So going back to self-centeredness, if I believe that who I am is what I think, I believe thinking is the creator of reality. Seems a little bit disjointed because there was a point at which I wasn't thinking. And at that point I wasn't thinking, certainly reality existed, certainly truth existed. And let's just call truth and reality knowledge, ever-presence, a state of consciousness that is an absolute, inviolable, indivisible, absolute state of being present. And let's call that our presence, our present, and our presence. All of ours, not mine, not yours, all of ours. Something we share equally. There's no discrimination in this. There's no segregation in this. There's no diminishment in this, only appreciation and greatness, because it's inclusive of everything everywhere. All that is and all that are included in that thought, in that awareness. If I subject my thinking to thoughts that are absolutely not true, I subject my thoughts to fantasies that I want to make believe are realities. That's a conflict. And technically, that's defined as insanity. Seeing and hearing things, talking to myself and thinking to myself about myself is thinking simply about an idea of who I think I am. That's really just an illusion. It's just an imagined thought, an idea that I now have taken so seriously as to make believe it's all that I am. So what do I think? Everything I think must come true. Because I'm the creator of truth and reality, my expectations are only what should happen is what I think should happen, should have happened when I started. And all of a sudden, my life becomes a constant struggle against all things happening because they're not going according to the plan that I had, and my thinking about why I made a decision to have those things even begin. If I am at the center of that choice to think what I want, and I would say if we're free to think, if we have free will, which is pretty evident, that means that we can will what we want. And what we want is what we will. And when I am operating on the basis of who I am as being who I'm actually not, getting back to this creation of something that we call self, if it has no basis, it doesn't exist except in my thoughts. And if you have those same thoughts about who you think you are, and we're on a collision course and yet maintaining the same basic premise in our thinking, that all we are is what we think, then we are simply putting different masks, different faces on the same problem and making believe that the distinction between us qualifies us as proof for what we're trying to do, rather than notice the conflict that it creates between each of us in terms of our thinking. When I think who I am is all I think, I become very, very highly sensitive to what everyone else thinks about me. Because if anyone thinks I'm not what I think, they're putting the thinking I'm doing at risk, not me, not my essence, not the chooser that chose that thinking. That isn't at risk because I'm still choosing to think that thinking is true. And that's an addiction. It's the idea that I have no other choice but to continue to do the wrong thing in the name of thinking someday it'll be right. And within thinking, that's insanity. That's mental illness. That's mental anguish. That's emotional turmoil. There is no emotional sobriety. Sobriety is about sane living. It's about starting to see that if I have an allergy to alcohol, for instance, which is clearly defined as one of the bodily abnormalities, an allergy is an abnormal response to something. So what does that mean? I eat peanuts, my throat closes up. It's not a normal response. Something is wrong. Some predisposition in my genetic structure, whatever it may be, is telling me, don't eat peanuts. And when it comes to peanuts, typically, because my throat closes, I want to stop. I don't want to do it again. I stay as far away from peanuts as I possibly can. But when the effect, like alcohol, feels better, or the drug gives me some momentary relief and sense of control and sense of prowess, not only am I simply treating the symptom, but I'm ignoring the source and the cause of that problem that is creating the instability. I'm simply using my feeling, again, the effect, as the problem. So I'm trying to fix the problem by treating the effect or the symptom of the problem as the problem. And that isn't accurate. It's another misstep in the process, but it's natural because once I take the initial misstep that who I am is all I think, I've created this fractured landscape where I've got to constantly come up with new ways to manage all those, like the kaleidoscope of images, trying to put the image back together, a broken mirror. I'm trying to put it all back together and have it finally be right when in fact the premise of my thinking is still wrong. So I continue to fracture it as I go. So if the management of those ideas that I'm having are unmanageable, it's because there's nothing there to manage. Absolutely nothing there to manage but the thought I'm thinking. So where does this all start? Let's go there. Let's talk about that. Actually, we won't talk. I'll talk. You can listen. If I have the choice to think what I want, then you have that choice to think what you want. And thus we have that choice to think what we want. If that's what free will is, it means that will is a function of choice. When I want something, I will it, and I choose to do something about it to get what I think I want. If we share that, then there's some evidence that there's something common between us, as distinct as it can seem to be, as distinct as we can think it is actually common between us. And it starts to point to this fact that there is some unified field or energy or something somewhere that must be here now too, because it couldn't be unified and exclude us. It would just naturally be us. It would be common between us and normal between us and natural. And it isn't even between us. It just simply seems to be wherever we are. And it seems also, by the way, to be where everything else is too, that doesn't seem to have a brain. Because all those things, trees, plants, etc., seem to know exactly what to do without thinking. They don't tend to argue. They don't have world wars. They don't subject themselves to fights. They simply take what they need from nature. They don't tend to take more than they need unless they're hibernating, and then they're taking what they need for a period of time. They know they're not going to be able to get what they need for hunger purposes. But it's all very regulated within nature. It's unnatural for us to think about these things in such excessive ways to try to compensate for an instability we're creating at the most fundamental level. That's not natural, but it's natural to as a consequence of what's unnatural to begin with. So where does this all start? If thinking is not the problem, because it's something we're given to do to help us survive and navigate the environment, which is what thinking is designed to do, it's constantly analyzing all the data that our senses are feeding it and all of the information that it has, all of it, whatever it is, it's analyzing it all the time because it's intimately built into the system of nature. So it's analyzing, comparing, contrasting, weighing, estimating, guessing, It's doing its best to give us the best information we can at any point, because at any point, if I make a decision, I'm basing it on limited information, because in the next moment, there's more information. So any of my conclusions are constantly subject to new information, so they're constantly changing. And for me to think that my conclusions, because I think my thinking happens to be real and true, needs to be set in stone and fixed once and for all, is again to think that reality is up to me, because reality and truth don't change. And maybe you can start to see the evolution of the thinking that goes with this in this fractured state of constantly trying to think about things right, because the thing we're thinking at the most elementary point is wrong. So one of the issues is here. You have no obligation, wherever you are sitting, nobody has any obligation to hear what's being said. None whatsoever. You will do with this what you want to do. And if you are entertaining obsessive thoughts, and I would almost guarantee you that you are to some degree, because this is a human dilemma, it's a human problem, because it's a potential problem at all times. We can always think a thought that isn't true and make believe it's true. That's always a possibility within the realm of all things we can do at any point during the day. Anytime. It's always possible. So to think that it's impossible to do that, and the job is to never do that, becomes another impossibility. The fact is, it's always available, it's always possible. Question is, if we do that thing that causes those effects that are uncomfortable and discomforting, aren't the effects being caused evidence of a greater sense of knowing better? Isn't the disturbance and the instability and the discomfort and the anguish and the anxiety all evidence that we have a clear understanding of knowing what's wrong? And humans seem to be very good at figuring out what is wrong with everyone else and everything else. And yet, while they do that, they tend to have some sort of internal struggle with doubt, insecurity, a sense of place. All those kind of arguments come up internally. And these internal arguments are primary to our experience. The brain happens to be where thoughts are originated. We don't see the thoughts, but we know their effects, just like subatomic particles being investigated by physicists aren't seen. So they put them into circumstances where they can watch what they do, and as a result, see what they do and watch their effects. We know what we're doing by watching our effects, seeing the effects of what we're doing, the symptoms, the byproducts. And if we're capable of doing this, it is our own volition, yours and mine, that are making these choices as to whether or not to see things clearly and honestly, or whether or not to protect the ideas we're maintaining. So while some ideas may seem challenging, I would suggest simply to notice the challenge. Notice the tendency toward defensiveness. Notice the upset that tends to come, the discomfort. Boredom is an example of trying to shut things down, trying to go numb. Boredom is a sense of numbness. There's no inspiration in boredom. It's an attempt to make believe that numbness is salvation. Drug abuse and alcoholism and all these other kinds of symptomatic behaviors and out of control behaviors are all trying to numb us by giving us a sensation that we like in place of the one we're actually having. So we're missing the opportunity to honestly evaluate and assess what's happening in our own thinking by making believe what we need to do is feel better about it. We're actually managing the idea that we should be continuing to maintain the thing that's causing the disturbance, the instability, and the discomfort. It ends up maintaining it. So it's all happening within thinking's gaze. Now, if thinking is actually designed to help us, and what it has turned into is a seeming enemy to us, we're obviously doing something that isn't right. We've obviously miscalculated, been misguided, mistaken what we're doing with it. And I would suggest it's just an overuse of thinking about thinking. So I tell you this because if you're listening, this isn't about what anybody else thinks. It's about what you do with it. I can't tell you anything that you don't know. If this is correct, if what we're talking about is accurate here, and I'll get to this in a little bit, then you already know. everything there is to know because you're a part of everything that there is. You're not apart from any of it. None of us are. Nothing can be. It would be impossible to be apart from something that's absolute, that's infinite. And even if it were finite and we were a part of it, we would still be a part of that finite thing, not apart from it. We couldn't be apart from it. We would always be a part of it, though we can feel apart from it and we can think we're apart from it. And as a result, feel apart from it. Those are possibilities, options. So your experience is up to you. So one thing we seem to have is a switch, an on-off switch. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, just like the binary process in computing. Zeros and ones, zeros and ones, zeros and ones, adding up in different combinations to allow all possibilities that the computer is able to function on the basis of it and all the information. It calibrates it all on a binary system. So if we have that same system and I'm choosing, yes, I want to go ahead and defend what I'm doing, and I want to continue to make believe that what I'm doing is all there is to do and it's right, and anybody else who says anything that offends me doesn't point out the fact that I can't be offended if I'm not defensive over something, then I'm missing some part of the equation. I'm missing the opportunity to actually begin to notice that my body's giving me accurate information about what's happening, and I am then choosing to see it as something I need to get away from because it's disturbing or uncomfortable or uneasy. Rather than say, if it's uneasy, that's what disease is. Dis-ease is uneasy and discomforting and disturbing because it is rocking, undermining our stability. It is undermining our potential. It is actually posing a threat to our survival, which is exactly what addiction is. Addiction is building a fort to keep the enemy in. And wonder why we can't seem to get away from this impending sense of doom and fear. It isn't a coincidence, and it is not a curse. It is an absolute consequence of our misuse of thought. That's all. And within thought, when it's misused, it naturally gives us information that is disturbing to get our attention, just like if I had my arm cut off, the nerves would tell my brain, something's wrong. We need attention here. Why is it giving me that signal but to help me survive? Giving me accurate information to give me a chance not only to survive, but to thrive. We've forgotten that survival is about thriving. And yet our population, despite everything we've done in terms of toxic pollution and poison and emotional turmoil and wars, we are at a greater population than we have ever been. So somehow we seem to survive even in the face of the onslaught of opposing forces that we create to diminish our capacity and diminish our appreciation. Literally diminish our capacity as though we do not have the capacity to function properly. Just like in the law, if you have no capacity to function mentally, you can't be guilty of doing anything. We're striving to create a diminished capacity to claim we're irresponsible for what we're doing, and we are not. Responsibility is not a negotiable aspect of life. If life is responsible for life, then we as a function of life, as a product of life, are responsible. It's very simple. Now I can think I'm not, and we can think we're not. And then thus we can witness what we're witnessing today, which are mass murders happening pretty regularly, making no sense. There's no vengeance involved for the most part, other than the attempt of a person who is obviously at odds with themselves trying to get even. And there is no getting even when you're at odds, ever. Just a perpetuation of being at odds. Why? You're the odd person out. Why? Because you think you don't belong. You think someone else has wronged you. You think something else somewhere else has done something to justify you doing the worst thing rather than the best thing. It's very simple. So where does this stem from? We'll go back there. If I think about a car, I think about a car. I do not think I become the car. I may want the car. And if I was to get the car and think by having the car, now I had all I needed and never got into the driver's seat and turned the key and started the engine and pressed the gas and pressed the brake and used the steering wheel, I would not be utilizing that car at all. So the whole point of having it would be useless, absolutely useless. So the point of our brain is effectively useless when we make believe that when we think about our thinking, and just sit with this in terms of this point I was making about you being the one that makes the decision as to whether you look at things honestly. It doesn't have to happen quickly. It doesn't have to happen at all. You have no requirement whatsoever to listen or even be engaged in this conversation. None. If you are happy doing what you're doing and you're productive doing what you're doing and you feel useful in what you're doing, that may be all you need and that will be all you do. And that's perfectly fine. That's how you're going to choose it. That's how you're going to do it, period. It's what we're doing right now. Everybody in the world is choosing what they want. And what we have right now is what we want. How it is right now with all the failings and all the insecurities and all the doubts and all that, those things are absolutely the sum total of everything each of us are thinking right now. So from a point of view of responsibility, it's worth noting that and then considering things. Consideration is a meditative contemplation, effectively. It's taking a position of neutrality rather than one opposing or in favor. Here's what's interesting about truth and reality. Truth does not need to be thought of to exist, nor does reality. Anything that's absolute, anything that's inviolable, indivisible, indiscriminate, has no need for what we think to exist. It exists despite what we think. And we can spite it all we want and spite what we think all we want. It will not change it. Shakespeare has a sonnet 116 on love. And it says, when altereth it finds, it does not alter, meaning love does not change in the face of change. It stays the same. He's talking about an absolute presence. This has been referred to through history. Rumi is a great poet from the 12 and 1300s that talked about it, but it preceded him from the beginning of the Greeks and others who were beginning to look at absolute and relative concepts very clearly, thousands of years ago. So again, what's the point? If I think about my thinking, here's an interesting bit of fact. If I think about my thinking, aren't I just thinking about my thinking? But if I think about my arm, I don't think I become my arm, like I don't think I become the car. But when thinking thinks about itself, somehow I begin to have the presumption that the self thinking thinks about is who I am. I become defined by that self now. I have become a product of thinking. I have been born from thought. And why would that thought be self-centered? Because it's centered in thought. It's the only basis for its existence is what I think about it. Now, could it be that the problem has been so clear and so visible and in such plain sight and ignored so long? Isn't it seem preposterous that it could be so simple? Yes, it does. It seems preposterous to all of the ideas and all the reasons and all the conflicted ways we've twisted and turned to try to create cultures and rationale and justifications and mythology and superstition and all these contorted views of the world simply to substantiate the twisted nature of that one seed. So where's the evidence? Well, look in your own experience. If who I think I am is not who I am, wouldn't I naturally, being committed to that thought, it is who I am, feel displaced, feel disconnected, feel a lack of worth, feel a lack of esteem, feel a sense of self-loathing, and act in ways that are self-abusive to a self that is no more than what I think? And when I'm thinking and talking to myself, aren't I actually creating an image of a self that exists as though there's something to talk to and think to, other than simply thinking about my thinking? Haven't I turned thinking and thus understanding and reason into my God, my sole source? My answer to all those questions, as I started seeing this clearly, is of course. If self-centered thinking is at the root of the problem, and self-centered thinking is defensive and reactive and willing to kill my body for the sake of ridding itself of something that doesn't exist, that's a pretty insane approach to life. It's a death wish. So what do I do when I'm living with that death wish? I create comfort zones. I create ways of managing that so I can feel better about it all the time. I have to run more, eat better, all things that could be healthy for me, but all of a sudden become obsessive. Now I have to run 80 miles a day. If I don't eat everything perfectly from the best farms in the world, all of a sudden I know in my heart something's seriously wrong because I violated the terms I have of trying to fix this thing, when in fact the thing I'm trying to fix is nothing more than I think. It's imagined. I'm trying to treat a self. I'm trying to help a self that isn't anything more than imagination. It's fantasy that I've taken for granted as reality. There is no reality in fantasy, and there's nothing wrong with fantasy. We are given brains to imagine. And imagine that we've taken that same brain we've been given and imagined who we are as only what we think, which then has us become extremely conscientious about what everybody else is thinking, because if they don't think like I think, they now become a threat to my supposed life. So we've turned the thing that we've been given to give us the greatest capacity to imagine possibility and the expression of that possibility, and turned it against ourselves to the point where suicide's at an all-time rate, overdoses are an all-time high, addictions at an all-time high, drug use, alcohol use is at an all-time high. We've even created industries now based on drug addiction. It used to be illicit drugs. Now it's legal. So what are they doing? Legalizing drugs. We do not talk about this honestly in society. And my sense is Bill Wilson wrote about it honestly, but I don't think he had the rational cognition in the way, because his focus was on simply looking at creating something for alcoholics that had never existed. In the history of humans, there had never been a common program to give people the opportunity with assurance, and millions of others who had already done it at this point, to say, yes, there is a way. There is an option. He was alone to begin with, and it took him 6 months to get anyone to even respond. I am not surprised that people are enraged in this conversation often, and reactive and defensive, and have storylines and narratives that have been developed in that understanding of who they think they are, that have been developing narratives to give them images of the picture of themselves that is nothing more than made up in thought. Being defensive is natural because lies only are based in thought. A lie doesn't actually exist except in thought. Think of what a lie is. A lie is only ever claiming to be true. What is it claiming? To be the only thing that it isn't. How can something be based on being what it's not and have any basis at all? It can't. We are offended by liars, we call people. When it isn't, they aren't liars, they're just lying. In their own thinking, they're lying. Thinking is something we do, it is not something we are. And when we misuse it and give ourselves the impression that we become what we think, this fractured state of feeling disconnected and alone and apart from, and constantly needing to seek to feel better about that, is actually the addiction of mental obsessive thinking. It's a mental illness. And I'm not diagnosing it as a doctor or any kind of licensed person. I am not telling you not to do whatever you're doing with anybody you're doing it with to feel better. I'm suggesting that if you start looking at this and start contemplating what we're talking about, you will find that you don't need to agree with it when you contemplate. You do not need to agree that 2 + 2 is 4 to apply it to a math problem and have it work. But here's the beauty and the grace and the generosity and the abundance and the forgiving nature of this absolute state of being. We don't have to agree with it. We don't have to have faith in it. We don't have to believe in it. We don't have to trust it. But when we have faith in something that's faithful, and when we trust something that is trustworthy, and when we have hope in something that is hopeful, and when we agree with something that is agreeable, I will assure you, your experience will change dramatically, because the stability we've been looking for has never been anywhere other than where we are. And all we have ever done is created an internal system that gave us an impression that was not true, that felt rocked, that felt disconnected. We felt ashamed and guilty. Why? Because we were guilty for the shameful act of making believe who we are is simply what we think. When who we are is intimately connected to an absolute source. And that source, by the way, is primary to, this isn't some secondary thing to get to. This is the primary thing that we've been before we even got here. If that source exists, and I'm not saying that it does, I'm just saying imagine that it does. Begin to wonder if it does. Begin to ask yourself, if we only think we're finite, what would be limiting the finite? What would be finite about the finite if there weren't something infinite beyond it? Why is it this universe keeps expanding? What is it expanding into if the bounds of the universe keep getting bigger? There must be something there drawing us toward it. And if it's drawing us toward it and it's absolutely where we are, even the concept of an expansion or growth is a chance to think it's going to happen at some other time rather than now. It's like the idea of forever. Forever never comes. It's torture. But the present nature of our existence is always here. And it isn't in doubt. You can doubt it and you can think things and you can impact your experience, your human experience, and make believe that what you're thinking is so true is to make that truth untrue. But I can assure you, there is no, the truth and reality and absolute knowing and consciousness and awareness and all of these absolute principles, infinite, are not rocked whatsoever by what we think. They are not changed. All of the other dimensions, even within this relative experience we're having that go beyond the fourth dimension, start to reveal a seamless essence. Seamless. That isn't disconnected from where we are because we only witness time and space and think that's all that we're in. We are a part of the rest of all that too. We can't be apart from some of it and have any of it absolute in any way. And if each dimension depends on the other dimensions, we are intimately a part of all those dimensions. And this is not space talk, and this is not fantasy. This is actually talking about reality and truth in real and true terms. I don't say I get the words across accurately because they're incomprehensible to even imagine this absolute state of being. Think of something that never changes. It doesn't think because it knows everything. There's nothing to think about. It's complete. It's whole. There's no doubt. What does that offer us? All possibility all the time. All the time. What does that possibility include? Certainly not having to suffer the indignation and the righteous indignation of our own internal conflict that we create and thinking it's the only thing we can do. Certainly one of the possibilities is begin to notice what we're doing and see what we're doing, and to notice that if we're treating effects like symptoms and trying to get over them, we're not looking at the cause accurately. And if we look at the cause accurately, we begin to recognize that when we see it honestly, there's no sense to continue doing anything that's insane. Recovery is beginning to see that honestly. Recovery is beginning to say, oh, why would it be recovery if we weren't recovering something we've always had? Even the word suggests it's recovering something we've seemingly given away. We are each whole. We are each complete. We are each exactly where we are right now. Look at your own circumstances. One thing to start looking at that is that everything that is happening, wherever you are, is happening now. And everything, including what I'm doing here now that you might not be able to see, you may in your mind's eye look and think you see, but what may seem invisible is actually visible to you. It's not invisible. It's well within the realm of the interconnectedness that we share. We don't have to see it to know that it's there any more than you have to think the rest of the world is beyond the horizon for it to exist. We have been thinking, like humans thought, that the earth was at the center of the universe. We have perpetuated that thinking because we didn't learn from Copernicus when he said the earth is not at the center of the universe, and watched all the havoc that was created by him introducing that thought to a structure of educated people who thought that it was, and how defensive they were about that and threatened his life to take back what he said, which he eventually did because he figured it was better than burning at the stake. But he knew what he knew, and he recognized that, in fact, we weren't at the center of the universe. And what we have not gotten over yet as a civilization that has not been very civilized, by the way, as a result of this, not getting over this point, is that it wasn't the earth that humans thought was at the center of the universe. It was humans that thought they were the center of the universe. It was thinking that they thought was the center of their universe and their world. And if the world is in perfect order and doing what it's doing, and the universe is doing what it's doing perfectly, and I'm thinking I need to understand it before I can actually appreciate it, I am using misunderstanding as the basis of my understanding. It is doing what it's doing regardless of what I think and what you think. And again, as evidence, notice what happens around you isn't what you think should happen, isn't what you think will happen, isn't what you think was going to happen, isn't what you expected to happen. What's always happening is what happens. Very simple. The only reason expectations seem to be a problem, and I would suggest that expectations are always connected to any willful act that we take, meaning any choice we ever make. We always have an expectation to get something. I don't go to the refrigerator to starve. I don't pick up an apple to wonder what I'm going to eat. My expectations are connected to those things, but when I think who I am is what I think that when I think something and make a decision, everything has to follow that track. Every circumstance and every person needs to follow that track, or my life is at risk. And it isn't my life that's at risk. Only the thought that I'm thinking is who I am. That isn't a life. It's simply a thought. It's something I do. It isn't something I am. My brain thinks. I have a body. If I have a body, what my body does is something it does. It doesn't define who I am. It's simply a reflection of what I'm thinking. If I want to be an idiotic in my actions, all I need to do is think idiotically. It's very simple. It's very easy. Something I can easily do. It's something I've done, I would say, the majority of my life, or this experience of life that I've had. Our bodies are life forms. Our performance. Think of these words: performance, information. It's all about form. It's all about shape. It's all about size. It's all about appearance. We're projections that take form and take shape so we can interact and experience this planet so far and the universe around us from a human perspective. It is not the only perspective we have, but if we're misusing the option of what we've been given, we're going to be in conflict with others and kill them just to justify the indignation we have for what we're each doing, the righteous indignation that we have for what we're doing in our own thinking. And we're going to align with people who are doing those sorts of things for the sake of thinking it's the only thing we can do. It's happened through human history. It's a choice. And it is not anything we're condemned to. It's something we freely choose and then act condemned to justify the embarrassment for diminishing our capacity and functioning on that diminished capacity as all that we are, and think that somehow it'll get better someday if we just keep doing the worst thing longer. Peace is the nature of love. It's the nature of reality. It's the nature of presence. It's silent. It does not speak a word. And like a white canvas can become any painting someone wants it to be. That silence gives us clarity and awareness and a present state of knowing when we're wrong. And that is the human guidance system to recognize, to correct something that's wrong. And if what I think I need to do is correct the feeling I'm having about it, I'm starting at the wrong direction because I'm trying to stop something without conceding that I'm starting it. And the real concession of addiction comes with recognizing that I am the cause of it. I am the responsible party for the choice I'm making. So as you contemplate these things, give yourself a little bit of room if you can. Notice that you already have the room. And as you begin to notice you already have the room, if you can concede that you already have the room and not start to notice that if you're in an infinite realm, there's no bounds to the room, it's absolutely boundless, that nothing that's limited is anything more than what you're thinking about it. Doesn't mean you can't think limited thoughts. That's what thoughts are designed to largely do. But they are also designed to express an infinite knowing that we all have that would exceed anything we needed to think about, because it would simply happen and come out of our mouth in ways that we couldn't even imagine saying. And begin creating things that we can't imagine doing. Especially when our imagination is thinking things that are so untrue as to think who we are is just this diminished capacity that's wandering around pitifully on the planet trying to figure out how to simply breathe deep enough to survive. We're designed to thrive. And that means that we are designed to produce much more than any of us need so that we can share in the abundance of what we all have naturally. We have a guidance system that when I am willing to be functionally literate, I begin to realize is giving me very, very well-written direction. And I just don't always want to hear it because I am committed to the fear and the anxiety and the stress and thinking somehow those things that are being unleashed in my body through adrenaline and all kinds of other chemical reactions that are corrosive to my existence are my new drug of choice. That new drive, that new confidence, that new ambition is going to get me somewhere, rather than realize I'm already where I've always been. I'm already in the place I can only be. I'm always present. And if I don't think I am, that's a major collision in my process. But it's just a choice. It's just a thought. It is no more than that. The undoing of it is the beginning of seeing what we're doing rather than what we're causing, what the effect of what we're doing. We've been seeing it backward because we've been thinking about it backward. And the reversal of addiction is to see things backward because we make believe who we are is what we think. That is a backward approach to life. Because life itself is knowledge. It is consciousness. It is pure. I may repeat these things. I do not know how to say them right all the time. I always listen to what I say and find holes in it and find things I could have been better about detailing and addressing. But it's helped me see that it isn't what I do, it's what we do, ultimately. You and I, wherever you are, starting to actually look out on the world that we share and start to see that there is an absolute common nature between us that we share without any division whatsoever, nationalistic, patriotic, whatever. There is no need for loyalty in something that's absolute, none, or allegiance. It simply is what it is, and it's always going to be that, no matter what I think. The quicker I come to terms with that, the quicker I can start expressing it with the bounty of information that starts to become so obvious that I had acted oblivious to because it would have undermined the structure of my nonsense. My literal nonsense, all of the ideas that I was perpetuating about who I am and what I think is truth and reality. Those relative concepts are never true or real. They're just decisions made in the midst of limited information. And every decision I've ever made has been immediately challenged by new information. And when I got used to that, it became a lot easier to start making decisions because I realized I could remake the decision and was always remaking the decision anyhow, even if it was the decision to keep making the same decision. It's a remaking of that because every moment is new. Every moment offers me all the possibility that's possible. And what does that mean? I can think something impossible is possible, but I will never be able to do anything about it effectively. I'll never be able to bring that thought into any kind of experience that's manifest in a way that could be abundant or shared by anyone else. It's the only problem with what's wrong is that it is not useful. It will never apply. The more I use it, the more damage I create. And addiction's very much this. Think about the drinking. Think about the drugging. Think about what we're witnessing on the streets around the world in the homeless situation. Giving people more latitude who are already struggling with their own well-being is to help them get worse. If they're struggling, what are they going to do but actually get better at struggling? You're going to give more latitude rather than actually talk about this honestly. And we are not talking about it honestly as far as I'm concerned, as far as I've heard. Because I have this conversation with people who are much better educated in sobriety than I am. And there are lots of stops and lots of resistance and lots of disclaimers and lots of opposition to the idea that it could be as simple as simply admitting it's where we are, it's always been here. And as I begin to talk about it, I begin to actually engage with people who are also in that exact same place and know it, by the way. None of this is news to you. You've always known it, or you wouldn't know what's wrong so clearly. You've always known it, or you wouldn't know despair so clearly. You've always known it, or you wouldn't know conflict and struggle so clearly and emotional turmoil. Emotional sobriety is impossible if we're thinking insane thoughts. We will always be emotionally disturbed. And to fix the symptoms is to maintain the problem. To start looking at the problem honestly is not to resolve the problem, because resolution is a constant resolving of the problem. It's not what we're talking about. We're talking about recognizing there is no problem when I start saying it honestly, because all it ever was an idea that something that didn't exist was true. Something that doesn't exist can't be true. So a lie cannot be true. That's the whole point of a lie. When a lie is a lie, it's true. No longer has any energy in it. There's no resistance. There's no persistence of it. There's nothing to hide. And I will suggest also, there is nothing hidden in the universe. Nothing. There are no mysteries. Everything has always been doing exactly what it's been doing based on everything that it is. We don't have to see behind the curtain to know that. So to use understanding in that way is to start to see that we've known it all along. We just haven't thought we did. And if we can't even admit the most simple aspects of what we're doing, what are the chances we're going to see the clarity of things that would be substantive to that? Not that we even need to know what's behind that curtain to know what that thing is ultimately doing now. What we can know about it is that it's doing what it's doing, whatever they are, subatomic particle, whatever the stuff's going on that we think we need to figure out. It's already figured out. It's happening right now. As it's happening, it's happening. All of it, everything, everywhere, now. You've always been in the present. There's nothing to strive for in that direction. And to think that you're not is an impossibility to ever think you will be, because the lie that you're maintaining will be committed, that will be reinforced by all that you do to try to find that other place. There is no other place. There is no past. There is no present other than in thought. They're concepts based on memory. The present is everything, the culmination of everything that's ever been thought and ever been done. And thinking is something we do. It's an action. The present is the culmination of all the effects ever created. So if you're looking for anything in your past, if you're resenting anything, if you're regretting anything, it's all here now that you're regretting that you're not paying attention to. The regret is not coming from what you did. It's what you're doing with what you did. It's what you're thinking about what you did now. The simplicity of this is that everything is resolved in the moment, or not even resolved, dissolved. Literally eliminated when you begin to see that it's only what we're doing in the present with what we're thinking that's causing the impressions that we're not where we belong, that we should be somewhere else, someone else, with something else, and we need more to get there. When in fact, all those things do is reinforce the idea that it has no basis. And the reason that there's not enough we can ever do is because we're dealing with something that has absolutely no substance. You cannot fill not only a void of absolute nothingness is impossible to fill. Doesn't matter what we do because we're not addressing it honestly. What we're here to do is talk about this honestly. And what I would ask that you consider is to look at it and look at your experience and start to notice that you've always had a greater knowing nature, that you've always known something was wrong, and that clarity is probably not wrong. Any doubt you have, any lack of confidence you have is actually an admission that that thing you have so much confidence in has no confidence. You've been relying on thinking being your source rather than recognizing that you have a knowing awareness that does not think at all. And that's your source. That's our source. That's the absolute nature of things. Relativity does not depend on absolute. It is an intimately connected aspect of what is absolute, a projection, perhaps an illusion. Basically, matter is made up of space. The amount of matter in matter is 0.0001% matter, and in that 0.0001% matter is 99.9999% space. So ultimately, everything is not as it appears. It isn't as solid as it seems. And the idea that we could be stuck in thinking is simply an idea fighting against an idea. that we create in our thinking. Thinking about thinking gives us the impression, thinking of itself creates a self born in thought. It isn't who we are, something we're doing. That's all. It isn't something we can't do. It's certainly something we can do given the history we've had of doing it. This conversation is about beginning to melt that by looking at it accurately and see that the veil that seems so solid was see-through the whole time. And just like in The Wizard of Oz, when the curtain was pulled back, he was not all the things that he projected himself as being. It's just a man standing in front of a bunch of levers, trying to make it all work to give him the appearance of greatness. Our greatness has no appearance. It's the substance of our essence that is invisible, but is recognizable. You know that you are aware that you are aware. We are all aware that we are aware. We all know that we know. And as we begin thinking that way, you will begin seeing people in much different ways than you have, because you will be compassionate for the thing they're doing when it comes to the thinking they're doing that's burdening them and hurting them and causing the sort of reactive idiosyncratic behaviors that seem so objectionable. You'll see that they're really struggling with something that is an illness, rather than see them as having to be condemned and removed from your view or hated to get rid of them. It shifts everything, gives us a chance to actually begin to heal, and gives us a chance to begin to see that the present moment is forgiveness, because there is nothing held against it, because there is nothing other than it. It's total and complete. There is no regret in it. I can't add anything to it, but I can preoccupy my thinking to think that my consumption of thought prevents me from recognizing it, when that's just lunacy to make believe that covering my eyes means that all the things I'm not seeing are no longer there. Even kids think that's funny when you play that game with them at 2 years old. We don't think it's that funny when we get older. Love is the basis of everything that exists. If that is our basis, then we already love everything and everyone. And the question is, why are we not that good at expressing it? What are we doing that is diminishing that capacity to express that bounty? It's what thoughts are designed to do, is express what we know. They don't need to analyze it. They don't need to weigh it. They don't need to compare and contrast to do that. And when I'm busy obsessively thinking about my thinking to try to create reality and truth, I think that other thing doesn't exist at all. And it's a self-imposed crisis of a self that doesn't even exist. Sit with that. I expect I will do some more of these. I'm going to call them, some of the original meetings we had many years ago were called meetings of the mind, meetings of minds, mom. So I think I'm going to call this mental obsession monologue. It's a contemplative effort. And your job is to listen and begin to notice the variation and flexing and fluxation of the thoughts you're having. You'll start noticing, as you start thinking of things in absolute terms, that the thinking all of a sudden becomes right-sized, because it isn't the dominant experience you're having. You start to see that, oh, in the midst of an infinite space, thinking is just something happening, just something I'm doing. It's like the wind blowing or a cloud going overhead. It doesn't block my vision unless I put my face up to my hand and get so close to the thing do I think it's all that there is. So I bid you farewell while not leaving you at all, knowing that where you are is where we all are, and that we all share, and starting to think in those terms, in the least, because it is natural and it is real, will become more obviously natural and easy because there's no conflict in it. And I will suggest to you that can be very disturbing when you begin noticing that, because the lengths you've gone, the lengths I've gone to make believe that who I am is only what I think, have literally threatened my life and others. And it is probably no surprise that people need near-death experiences to finally admit the awareness. And look into this a little bit. There's a show on Netflix about life after death, I think it's called. After, I forget exactly. There's a book by Dr. Bruce Grayson, who's one of the longest running researchers of this, called After. Isn't it interesting that it takes near-death experiences or people dying before they begin to witness the awareness that you and I have today? And my question is, why not simply concede it while we're alive, rather than create circumstances to allow us to finally have that awareness expressed in our human consciousness, in our human experience? I would say that's healing, and would be healing for many to be in the face of that rather than in the face of the anxiety and the disorderly conduct that we create and the maintenance of the disordered thinking that we've been doing, thinking is our sole source. Love you.